DOTI. Keith Borsheim is the project manager for HDR. HDR is the consultant who we have hired to do this first part of the design. Assisting Keith is Rick Plenge, and he is also a project manager. And then we have our senior community engagement specialist, Alexa Moreda. And with that, I'll pass it on to Alexa.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So first off, oops, sorry. Technical difficulties. Just want to do a couple of housekeeping items with you all this evening. You all are on mute, which is great. I think once we kind of get further into the presentation, we will actually turn our project team cameras off just to help with the bandwidth, help with any kind of virtual lag there may be out there in the interwebs. But yeah, so by all means, if you have a question, raise your hand, but we'd ask that you wait until we end the presentation. And or if you have a question that you're just dying to put out there, go ahead and drop that into the chat feature and type that up, and we'll make sure we'll get to that at the end of the presentation before we jump into a fun little exercise after this presentation. And if you see to the right, at the top right, you've got your camera off and mic off buttons, and over to the left, you will see where you can click on the bubble to add a chat, and then the raise your hand feature as well, with the smiley face and the hand palm up top. And then just a really quick meeting overview introductions for today. It'll take about 10 minutes to do a purpose of the meeting and kind of go over the project background and concepts, followed by next steps and where we're headed after this first public meeting that we have with you all, and then a quick little Q&A that will help kind of answer those higher level questions that you may have. And I think a lot of what questions may come up while you're listening to the presentation can definitely be answered and responded to during the 30-minute breakout room activity that we have today. It's going to be, just think like a virtual whiteboard experience where normally if you were going in person to a public meeting, you would write on a sticky note and have comments and or speak to the project staff. So it's the same concept, but just a virtual setting. And we'll walk you through that as well later on during the activity. And then last but not least, if you have any last minute questions at the end, we can regroup and kind of talk through those as well. All right, Ashley.
Actually, I think it's me, Alexa. Thank you.
Oh, hey, Keith.
Hi, everybody. As John said, my name is Keith Borsheim. I am with HDR. We are the lead consultant on the project, and I just want to go over real quickly here kind of why we're here tonight and a little bit about the project that we're here to discuss. So the project name here is at the top, Bucktel Boulevard Complete Street and Evans Intersection Improvements. So this project is really all about looking at Bucktel Boulevard between University Boulevard and Colorado Boulevard and providing a high comfort bicycle facility on Bucktel. In addition to that, along Bucktel, we are looking at bicycle and pedestrian crossing improvements. We are also looking at some lighting and or wayfinding improvements along that stretch of Bucktel. As far as the intersection improvements, there are 4 major intersections that have been identified for this project that are in need of safety and operational improvements. Those are the University Boulevard and Bucktel intersection, Bucktel Boulevard and Colorado Boulevard intersection, and then 2 intersections along Evans at University and at Colorado. Really, the focus of those intersection improvements is going to be multimodal improvements. So, looking at ways to improve the environment for pedestrians and bicyclists, and potentially, people using mobility devices like wheelchairs and that kind of thing. We'll also be looking at operational improvements at those intersections, improve signage, lane markings, and just ways to make traffic run smoother through those intersections. So this is part of what's now being called the University Neighborhood Safer Streets program. So this is just one project in this neighborhood that are all designed to make our streets safer. So you see this Elevate Denver Bond project. That's the one we're here to talk about tonight. That's why it's got the star there. But just a quick note about the other projects that are going on in the area. We are seeing some sidewalk gaps being filled in where we have missing sidewalks, particularly in the University Park neighborhood. We're also looking at bike projects along other stretches of Bucktel Boulevard, so to the west of our project, west of University, looking at protected bike lanes. That is planned for installation next year. Also a neighborhood bikeway connecting the U Hills neighborhood to Colorado Station. That's along Birch. And finally, a new signal project at Evans Avenue and Ash Street. So on the next slide here, we see those projects mapped. And the key here is that we have the light rail stations at Colorado Boulevard and at University, near the University of Denver. And those are really our two big hubs of activity in the area. And the main purpose of the Bucktel Complete Street project and Evans intersection improvements is to really provide a safer place for people to access those major activity hubs. So it's really getting people between those activity hubs and from the neighborhood in between those and accessing those safely. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Ashley, who will walk us through how we got here and give us a little bit of background on the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith, and thank you all for joining us on a Wednesday night. I know you all probably have lots going on, so appreciate your time in this project. So wanted to give a little bit of background to explain why we are at the place we're at with this project in terms of moving into design. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of background to this project. I see a number of familiar faces on this meeting, so I know a lot of you probably are familiar with this background, but for those of you that aren't and or could use a refresher, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So these projects, the Bucktel Complete Street and the Evans intersection improvements, are really the result of a lot of effort that was especially kind of focused in on 2017 and the years leading up to that. So that includes the University Station, Colorado Station multi-station plan and mobility study that Transportation Solutions actually helped spearhead with support of the City of Denver, and the subsequent Next Step study, which was led by the City of Denver. We're going to talk about that. And then the funding for this project today was building off those studies and is provided by Elevate Denver Bond, which was passed in 2017. So speaking a little bit more about that original study on the next slide, this slide speaks to what that study purpose was, as well as what those goals were. So in a nutshell, the goal was to really kind of look at those two station areas and think about how we could turn those more into mobility hubs. Really think about the transportation network surrounding those two stations and connecting those two stations and make sure that those are, safe multimodal transportation networks to help folks get to those stations and around those areas. I mean, we've got the University of Denver, which is a major educational anchor for the City of Denver, as well as we've got a growing transit-oriented development over around the Colorado Station area. So wanting to think about how we're connecting all of those areas and thinking strategically about kind of the land use there as well. Next slide. So we did a lot of, with that study, there was a lot of community outreach. I mean, over 40 neighborhood and university meetings in a pretty short stretch of time there, 2 pop-up events, community workshop, and then a final public meeting. And that was all just for that study to really kind of get through all the, what is the big picture vision here for this area? What are those transportation recommendations, et cetera? So again, that study led to the Next Step study. And part of that was this recognition that that study had a lot of wonderful ideas, and we needed to flesh those out a bit more so that we would have something very specific that we could put in the bond, so we could get something specific funded. So the next step study looked at all those major transportation projects, in particular those recommendations, and helped define those a bit better, helped put some concepts together that helped define those, as well as some funding, and then also helped us prioritize those. And so based on that next step study, we put together the language for the bond project that passed, that really focused on those high priority, those things that, I don't know if you were able to see on that previous slide, but there was a prioritization of 1, 2, 3. Those that were in that kind of priority 1 are essentially what is captured in the bond language. Thanks, Alexa. Next slide. So the focus being making Bucktel Boulevard from University to Colorado a complete street, and then improvements to 4 intersections along University and Colorado. And that's why we're really focusing in on the University Bucktel, University Evans, Colorado Bucktel, Colorado Evans intersections. And that's a little history as to how we got to where we're at today. As far as how we're delivering this, or how where we're at in the process and how we are moving forward, there is a recognition that, you know, this was all just identified in 2017, and that there's you know, a need to, those were preliminary cost estimates. We do think that everything we want to accomplish may be a bit ambitious in relation to the funding we have available thanks to the bond. So part of what we're doing right now is really working on kind of better defining those concepts and starting to move into that preliminary design. And we're doing that for all those bond elements that we just talked about, the Bucktel, as well as those 4 intersections. So we'll be looking at costs, property impacts, et cetera, thinking about how can we really tighten those up as best as possible and make sure we have a really clear picture of what we want to design moving forward. And then part of what we're going to do as part of this effort is then think about what's the best way to sequence these things, because there are a lot of moving parts to all of this, and what are the priorities that we're going to hear from you all as part of the public outreach process, to make sure that we know, you know, given that we may not have sufficient funding right off the bat to deliver every single thing, we want to make sure we fully understand what the priorities are so that we can sequence that appropriately, and know as we move into phase 2, which is going to be kind of the next phase where we go into final design, we'll be going into final design for the things that we know we can definitely construct because we have the funding available. And we're also going to be working on, you know, identifying funding streams for the remaining pieces that we may not have funding for today, but we anticipate finding that funding for. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but the intent is to deliver everything we, you know, talked about in the bond, but it's a matter of figuring out how to prioritize that, et cetera, which will be a part of this process. So again, right now we're in that concept refinement and prioritization of these different elements process. And this graphic just kind of illustrates that, you know, this whole thing is really dependent on hearing from you all. There's a lot that we want to accomplish in this area. As always, you know, resources are always tricky. So we're going to keep coming back to you as we move through this design process, to make sure that, you know, we are prioritizing the right elements, that we're really focusing on what is the real true need with each one of these different locations, and making sure that our design is achieving the intent that we want to achieve based on your feedback. So feedback is going to be a really important piece of all of this. As we move forward, and has been since day 1. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it back to Keith to walk us through what are those concepts that we are starting from.
Thank you, Ashley. And just a reminder, these are the concepts that came out of the next step study that Ashley mentioned. So just an acknowledgement that, you know, some time has passed since that time, since these concepts were developed. And in the meantime, the city has been working hard on updating its design guidelines for complete streets and that kind of thing. So we are revisiting these concepts as part of this process, and you know, hoping to identify not only better designs, but also designs that might be a little bit more affordable. So on this slide, we see the Bucktel Complete Street cross section on the left that included what is called a 2-way cycle track That is the portion that is the green portion on the right side of that cross section, where you see the bicyclists going in either direction. That would be on the south side of the street. And also on this slide, you see some of the proposed crossing improvements at some of the intersections along the way. During this phase, we will be examining whether the two-way cycle track on the south side of the street is the right solution. We'll be looking at perhaps protected bike lanes instead, or perhaps using the trail that exists along Prairie Park for bicycle facility. All of this stuff is a little bit being reconsidered at this time, and will be part of this design phase. The next concept that we have to show is the University and Bucktel intersection. So at this intersection, the concept is really safety and operations improvements, reducing the number of lanes at that intersection for cars, and providing more space for bicycle movements. As we move into this complete streets design, we need to recognize that providing more space for people on bikes and people on foot is an important goal for the city. During this phase of the design, we'll also be looking at are the number of lanes shown on this concept still appropriate for this intersection? And of course, we need to tie into both the bicycle facility selection that is made on the west side as part of this project, as well as the bicycle facility that is proposed to be installed next year, which is a protected bike lane on each side of the street. That is on the west side, and as part of this project, we're looking at the east side. So west of this intersection, we're looking at protected bike lanes going in next year, which is different than what was shown in the concept from the Next Step study, which had the cycle track on the south side. At the other end of this corridor is the Bucktel and Colorado intersection. Again, re-examining that cycle track shown on the south side, and making sure that the solution at this intersection addresses whatever facility type is chosen for Bucktel, but also looking at some additional pedestrian enhancements, things like leading pedestrian intervals, which are, it's a signal timing thing that you may have experienced where you get a head start before cars begin their turning movements. The walking sign comes up before the green light for cars. So those are other considerations. Also, raised medians are being proposed at this location. So we will be examining all of that and entering into the design phase for this intersection as well. Okay, next intersection is Evans and University. So if you're familiar with this intersection, it is very busy with pedestrian traffic and with vehicle traffic. Obviously, being directly adjacent to the university and the Main Street area on University Boulevard, we see a lot of conflict between pedestrians and vehicles making turns in particular. So the concepts that were developed for the Next Step study looked at signal timing changes and phasing changes, as well as perhaps the addition of right turn lanes to alleviate some of the bottleneck conditions that result from people waiting for pedestrians to cross. So again, looking at refinements here and making sure that we are able to limit our impacts to adjacent properties. Obviously, the buildings here are right up against the sidewalks on 3 of the 4 corners. And on the other corner, we have a nice property that is part of the university. So pretty tight situation here for making any improvements to widen any of the road or any of the sidewalks. So that is what we'll be looking at through this phase of the design at that intersection. And then finally, at Colorado and Evans, this is the concept that was developed in the Next Step study. This is an intersection of two major arterials, as you know, that are both actually part of the city's high injury network, where we see a higher concentration of serious crashes. And so this is a very important intersection to provide safety improvements. Again, we do see quite a bit of pedestrian traffic being so close to the Colorado Boulevard or the Colorado Light Rail Station, and some other land uses around the area. So we do see quite a bit of pedestrian traffic here as well. So being, cognizant of how providing, sweeping right turns or that kind of thing impacts pedestrian mobility. The concept that was developed in the Next Step study had raised crosswalks for the right turn lanes. That will be revisited. What we've seen is that there are some pretty substantial right-of-way impacts to the adjacent properties for some of these. So we are going to examine ways to provide that kind of safety benefit while potentially, hopefully limiting some of our impacts to those adjacent properties. So that is the high-level overview of the concepts. Again, it has been a number of years, and so we want to acknowledge a few things. One is that construction costs continue to rise, and that the city has developed further guidelines on its complete streets designs. So we're going to be incorporating all of those as we move forward into this design phase. I do want to just remind everybody that we do have a breakout room session coming up right after this presentation. So we do have a Q&A session that we'd like to focus on, higher level discussions, not necessarily these concepts, because we do want to get into the concepts when we break out into the smaller groups. So that's just a quick reminder. But from an overall project standpoint, the next steps, here is the overall schedule. You can see that we are in the middle of the mobility analysis, or just wrapping up the mobility analysis. That's where we're looking at traffic impacts of the various designs that we were discussing here today. Also looking, starting to investigate utilities in the area, which are an important consideration as we enter into design, and doing some surveying of the area. And then as we continue into the winter, we will be evaluating the different refinements that we're talking about as we head into that, and doing an environmental scan of the area to make sure that we're not having substantial environmental impacts. And then we plan to bring all that back to you all again in late winter next year, January, February timeframe, to discuss the refinements to the designs and select a design and incorporate your feedback into the designs. And throughout the late winter and early spring and of 2022, we will be getting this through a preliminary design phase, as Ashley said, to hopefully then select those elements that go into final design. So that is our next steps overall schedule. And then on the next slide, we just want to reiterate some of the public and stakeholder outreach that is ongoing. So you can see here, we are here at the virtual public meeting in November. And as I mentioned, the next public meeting is scheduled for February to gather your feedback on the refinements. And we do hope to get out and meet the community at various pop-up events in the spring as well, to make sure that people who can't attend an event like this have a chance to provide their feedback as well. There will also be questionnaires that are distributed. One is coming up that we'll talk about here just shortly, and we have a few other questionnaires planned throughout the winter. So without further ado, I think now is the opportunity to show the questionnaire QR code. So if you are able to go ahead and use your device, your mobile device, to pull up the questionnaire, or you can go to the website and find a link on the website for this questionnaire. It takes about 15 minutes. It's a pretty in-depth questionnaire that we hope to get a lot of feedback from the community on the project and the concepts. So it is, it's not jump in and do it in 5 minutes, but, it's an opportunity for you to really provide some important feedback into these concept designs. So that is that, and I think we're ready for Q&A. And I think Afor, are you going to lead the Q&A session?
Sure, I am happy to facilitate some Q&A here. Thanks, team, for all the information. We haven't gotten any questions dropped into the chat yet, but this is your opportunity to maybe even raise your hand and unmute. I see we've got Mike here who's got a question. Before we go to Mike, just wanted to remind people that if you have really specific comments around the concepts or maybe how you experience in the intersection or one of the areas, let's save some of those really good discussions for the breakout rooms. And what we'll do right now is just do some overall comments or questions that we've gone over so far. So we're trying to keep everybody in order here. We'll start with Mike. Mike, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the team a question, and we'll see if we can take care of it for you.
Yeah, my question is just on the overall timeline. Just given how long this has taken, the number of years, is there any way to trim down this next design phase and the number of environmental studies and things? I feel like it's now been going on 5 years and you're anticipating 2 more years for a bike lane. Just seems a lot. Is there, I guess, what is forcing that next design phase to be so long, given how much studying has been up till this point?
That's a great question. I'm gonna see if maybe Ashley or Keith would be able to handle that for us to talk a little bit more about the timeline and the design phase.
Ashley, would you like to take it, or you want me to take it?
Well, Keith, maybe you can handle why kind of this specific design phase and kind of the pieces that we need to cover, but just in general, part of what we're doing right now, in addition to the design and the concept refinement, is internally doing that sequencing. So figuring out, how can we make sure we have enough funds kind of lined up to get all of this installed, and what will be that sequence. So I think, Keith, you can speak to kind of what our current design is going to require. Unfortunately, once you get into engineering design, it does get complicated and does take time. There's a lot of factors going on in this area that we have to think about. And so I guess, Keith, I'm answering your question, but there's things like the environmental stuff. There's a lot of potential issues that we need to really make sure we've vetted and looked through and done our due diligence on with this project. There's a historic rail that used to run through Bucktel, which causes a need for a very thorough environmental assessment. As we touch Colorado, which is a CDOT roadway, we have to make sure we've done a lot of thorough due diligence there. So unfortunately, a lot of that stuff does take time. Keith, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add a few things. Mike, I totally get it. I understand the frustration, and I feel that frustration too. And I get it. I totally get where you're coming from. And you're right about the bike lanes. I think the city is doing a really good job now of installing bike lanes in a timely fashion, where it is a relatively easy thing to do. We see a lot of repaving projects that are incorporating bike lanes now. So that is a win-win, where we are able to maintain our streets and make an improvement basically within the same budget and in the same timeline. So the city is definitely making strides there. As far as this project goes, when the next step study identified the concepts that were developed, those concepts are pretty construction heavy. To install a cycle track and a wider sidewalk on Bucktel is something that is what we would call a capital improvement project. So that, that's why we went out for funding to find the money to do it. And that's why it requires quite a bit of engineering and, analysis of drainage and all of those impacts. So with all that said, we are hoping to find some cost savings and some schedule savings as part of this process, this design process. And that's what really this next 6 months is all about, is finding those savings and being able to advance certain portions of this project that are less capital heavy, and get those on the ground quicker than, Ashley mentioned a multi-year build out. And hopefully those elements, like a bike lane, if that's what ends up being selected, can be advanced quicker than, multi-years. Mike, does that answer your question, or any other follow-up information you'd like?
Yeah, a little bit, and I'll let other people ask questions too. I think I was getting more at, like, what are the specific things of why it takes so long, just given it is a pretty wide road and it's really just a bike lane. But I guess what I was getting at was, like, what are those very specific things that take 6 months, and can that be trimmed down, just given that this was studied 5 years ago? But yeah, I'll let other people ask questions too.
Yeah, we really appreciate the comment, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. We do have several comments and a couple of hand raised, and I think one of the comments is somebody who also has their hand raised, Steve. So hopefully I could get all this tracking right here. So Steve has a question. He says, is there any look at Bucktel and Monroe for possible intersection improvements? I'm assuming it's somewhat of a busy RTD bus area. So maybe we can talk a little bit about why the intersections that we were working on were chosen, and some of the scope for this project to help answer that question.
Yep, it's a great question, Steve. I think, or excuse me, Stephen, I do think that as we breezed through those concepts in the presentation, we did leave out some of the specifics along Bucktel. So specific to this question, yes, Monroe is being examined from a complete streets perspective, and we do plan to make some improvements for pedestrians and bicycles at that intersection. And yeah, acknowledging that RTD buses do require a little bit of extra space to make their turns. So we do need to, acknowledge that and design around that. But yep, that is part of the scope of this project.
All right, and so I guess we have got a couple different Stevens here, but I'm going to go to Jana Noble's question next, and then Stephen Fisher has his hand raised. So Jana Noble, her question: do you have any short-term plans for enforcing red light running and speeding at the intersection there, Bucktel and St. Paul? A good question for Ashley.
Yeah, I could take that. I think we've actually, Jana, I don't know if it was you or someone else, but we've actually heard that concern recently. So we have our area engineer. That's more of an area engineer type question, and they are actually looking at the traffic signal, the cameras there, to see what the compliance challenges are, and we'll kind of move forward once we better understand if there's running of the red light, and if so, kind of we'll work with DPD, the Denver Police Department, and or B, we will also determine if operational changes need to be made to the signal. So that is being looked at, not necessarily part of this project, but our area engineers are looking at that. And I think also offboard, there's a couple that are getting into the weeds of some of the concepts, so we can maybe hold those and take those over to the whiteboards, but maybe if there's a couple high-level questions.
Yeah, agreed. Let's see. We do have a question from Stephen Fisher, has had his hand raised. So we'll see what kind of question you have, Stephen, and if it's something we can answer here, or if it's something great for the breakout rooms.
Hi, this is Steve and Katie Fisher. We're on the west side. Once again, I'm questioning the whole concept of from one end to the other. We participated when we were talking about the west, and we're sharing these intersections such as Bucktel and University and Evans. I don't see how we're all in consensus of what's going to happen at these, and obviously it's the same intersection. So there was no notification over here on the west side that this meeting was going to be tonight. We noticed it because fortunately somebody put signs up along Bucktel Trail, and that's how we knew this was going to happen. So once again, I don't understand how we're going to try to make this a complete Bucktel when we don't have both groups hearing exactly the same story, and also what have the ideas that are being promoted on the west side. And as you brought up with like the bike trails, are we going to be jumping from south side to north side, or both sides, or all of that? So I'm a little concerned of the process. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you so much. Maybe Ashley can address some of the concerns there. Saw you unmuted, Ashley. So maybe there would be something you can help address.
Sure. I think what you're referring to is the Bucktel protected bike lanes west of University. And if that's the case, I am also on that project team and helping kind of look at the continuity between that project and this project. And internally, there's actually quite a bit of coordination between our design teams. And so, you know, I can see how maybe that didn't feel as coordinated externally, but we are working very hard, and that's part of why these are part of the larger program, is that we've identified there's a number of multimodal improvements happening in the area. So we are working on coordinating all of them, and so that is happening. As far as I guess consensus, or what are we going to be doing, there was quite a bit of discussion and study and outreach that was a part of that original study that did talk to you all and get that feedback. And so I do think that while, you know, Keith brought up a lot of the challenges, the concepts are, we're kind of working through with the concepts. I think that we feel there is a good sense of direction, and that's why they were included in the bond, is we do have a pretty good general idea of what we need to accomplish. And now it's like, what are the weeds of that? What does it look like as we get into that very technical design, and how do we accomplish the safety desires at each of these intersections, et cetera, in a way that makes the most sense with, because at that original plan and study level is a very high level look. We are now way into the details of what are all the volumes of vehicles, what types, what are their turning radius, all of that kind of thing. And that's what's starting to inform this design. But generally, I think we have a pretty good sense based on our past plans and studies of what we're trying to do here.
But once again, I know we looked at the highest level back in 2017 because I participated in that, but we weren't in any sort of agreement at all. It was, you know, it was all over the board. And now when we're getting down to, you know, we thought Bucktel was going to be on the west side. Let me clarify that. We were going to already have the bike lanes painted this last summer, and obviously that got delayed. But I still feel like so much is up in the air where we don't really know, you know, what both sides want. And obviously, and what's feasible, as you said, we need all those studies. We need to know ecologically and everything else. But I just don't think this is moving smoothly, and that we aren't going to end up with a lot of people unhappy because they really thought they were getting this safety improvement, and other people being convinced vote for the other safety improvement. So I'm not sold on this whole concept, but we will see. Thank you.
Thank you again for your comment. We do have a couple other questions that I think we can address here before we get into the breakout rooms. One of them is particularly around funding, just wanting to clarify if there will be additional funding for the project, and if the initial phases are being restricted to that kind of $8 million bond funding. And then we have a question about difference in bike lane. So we'll start with the funding question. Would that be a good one for maybe Keith to help address?
I can take that one. So I think you said it actually in your question, Rosemary. Will the initial phase be restricted to the 8.4? That's the funding we have, is 8.4. So yes, what we're working with right now is we have 8.4 million. We know that what we want to do to accomplish all of this is going to cost more than 8.4 million. Through this design, we're trying to figure out exactly what that cost is going to be, and keep that, as close to what we have funding wise available as possible. However, we recognize that it'll likely exceed 8.4, and so we are anticipating a need for, finding additional funds. We haven't identified them yet because we don't know exactly what that is even, and that's part of, again, what we're doing right now as part of this design effort, is to figure out what is that delta and how, and that will help us figure out how to, close that gap. So I hope that explains it. It's a little complicated, but yeah, we anticipate we don't have all the funding exactly, in place today, but we're going to figure out what that need will be so we can pursue it.
And then following that same, I guess not the same line, but the Rosemary has another question that maybe you can answer for us, Ashley. This is an easier one. Can you tell us the difference between a protected bike lane and a cycle track to help get everybody on the same page?
Sure, and this is, again, one we can really dive into in the mural boards. But what was proposed in the concept is a cycle track, which in this concept from the original study is actually a two-way bike facility that's behind the curb. So it's elevated and it's behind the curb. There's some, our closest thing that we have really in Denver that I can think of off the top of my head is actually in Rhino along Brighton Boulevard. So it would be a two-way facility. And so there's a protected facility. It can be a lot of different ways. Protected's a little bit more general, but it could be a single direction. So it could be a bike lane on either side of a travel lane with bollards or some other vertical protective element. So I don't want to get too more into that. Let's talk about that at the mural.
Okay. Well, I think this might be a great opportunity then. It doesn't look like there's any more kind of clarifying questions that we can address at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexa to get us ready for the breakout rooms.
All right. Okay. So the breakout rooms, just keep in mind, on my end, I'm going to split us equally into 2 breakout rooms on this call, and it will take anywhere between 10 to 30 second lag. So don't press anything or push buttons. Just be a little patient with the system on the back end, and then it will transfer you without you having to lift a finger. So just be a little patient. I'm going to go ahead and break us out into break rooms, and we'll meet back here afterwards.